Good evening and welcome to this evening's Lundy webinar. I'm Michael Williams and I'm Secretary of the Lundy Field Society. Following the tremendous success of the webinars during the spring, I've been organising an autumn and winter season of talks, and I hope you'll be able to join me over the coming months. The events won't be weekly, as I don't think I can sustain the level of organisation and work that goes on behind the scenes, and I'm sure that Dave Richards would like to have some free time too. I've put together a varied programme of events, and I'm going to tell you about what's coming up in future weeks later on. I should also welcome you back to the virtual Morisco Tavern, although I'm not actually far away from the tavern, as I am on Lundy at the moment. I have no idea how many people on Lundy are actually watching, but if you are, then I hope you can join me for a socially distanced pint of old light in the tavern when we're finished. I'm also crossing my fingers that the Lundy internet connection holds up, so I hope things are going to be okay. Our first webinar will follow the tried and tested formula that I used previously. I'm delighted that Andrew Cleave will be joining me again this evening to talk about Lundy's butterflies and moths, a talk which we've not been able to schedule during the summer. We'll then follow up with a question and answer session. Okay, so on to the usual housekeeping arrangements. If you're a regular viewer, then you may want to charge your glasses while I go through this usual announcement. Only the microphones and video cameras on Andrew's computer and my computer are enabled, so we won't be able to see or hear any of you watching at home. Those of you who are on Zoom are able to ask questions using the Q&A function. You need to click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and then type your question into the box that pops up. If you're on a mobile or tablet, then you can find it on the menu bar. There is also a chat feature for comments and feedback, which we'll be monitoring during the talk. If you're watching on YouTube, you're also very welcome, but I'm afraid there's no facility for asking questions. As ever, Dave Richards is behind the scenes hosting the Zoom session, and we'll make a recording available afterwards. Okay, so it's time for me to introduce our speaker. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Mike.
Can you hear me all right?
I can, thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for joining us this evening to tell us all about Lundy's moths and butterflies. I've got a brief biography to introduce Andrew. Andrew Cleave first visited Lundy over 50 years ago and has returned almost every year since. For many years, he led school field trips to the island and has made frequent visits to study the flora, moths and butterflies, and marine life. He has written more than 20 books on natural history, co-authored and contributed to many more, and written numerous articles for magazines. He regularly leads wildlife tours abroad for companies including Nature Trek, and he is also one of the founders of the Bird Photographer of the Year competition. Andrew is a committee member of the Lundy Field Society and also sits on the PCC that led the restoration of St Helens Church, both of which are good excuses for making frequent visits to Lundy. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew for our talk this evening about Lundy's butterflies and moths. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to Dave behind the scenes for doing all this. We had a training session, so I hope I can get this right. I think I need to share my screen now and load up the presentation. So one moment whilst we do this. I hope this is going to work. How are we doing?
That's great, Andrew. Yep, that's all working.
Okay, and actually I'm using quite an old version of PowerPoint. So if you're expecting it to be rather larger on the screen than this, I'm afraid it's my ancient version. But butterflies and moths. The butterflies, of course, are fairly obvious. Lovely sunny days on Lundy, and we all enjoy seeing things like this beautiful red admiral. But moths are a different matter. First, find your moth. There are many more moths than there are butterflies. The trouble is they don't really yield themselves up very well. As we walk around the island, we're probably passing thousands of them. And have a look here, this beautiful Brussels lace moth sitting quietly on a piece of granite. We'd walk by those all the time without realizing they're there. Now, a few technical details start with, there are probably 2,500 species of moths in Britain. About 900 of those are what we call the macro moths, quite the large ones, and the remainder, 1,600, are micro moths. By micro, some of them are really small, just a few millimeters long. In county of Devon, probably 700 different species could be recorded each year, because there are lots of habitats, of course, in Devon. On Lundy, our moth list was standing at about 350 species, probably a lot more now. Dean's been doing a lot this year. In each year, 100 species or more are recorded. We keep adding new records. But people who regularly trap moths know that the populations of almost all of them are decreasing. And you all know from the effect on your car windscreen on a drive on a summer evening that there are far fewer insects to scrape off the windscreen now. And people who regularly do this record diminishing returns. But strangely, although the numbers of moths, the actual numbers caught, are going down, new species are found each year. So there is a sort of migration or movement north. We know a lot more about the moths, we're better at identifying them, that the numbers the numbers of species certainly increase, and some new ones are actually colonizing and spreading. So there's mixed messages there, the actual numbers going down, but the range of species increasing. Then why bother with moths or butterflies? So some of them are very beautiful, they're fascinating things, but they're very important because they're food. The vast number of caterpillars out there provide food for birds. Lundy's good population of wheatears wouldn't really be there were it not for the fact there are lots of insects for them to feed on. Some more facts and figures. People who've studied birds going in and out of nest boxes have worked out that about 9,000 caterpillars, larvae, are taken in to one nest box just to rear a single brood of blue tits or grey tits. And Lundy's house sparrows will get through terrific numbers of the caterpillars and the eggs maybe of moths, and the moths themselves sometimes. So they're very important in the food chain. Now the moths don't really want to be eaten, of course, so either they hide away or make themselves look as intimidating as possible. We've probably all spotted these there on Lundy in the summer. Actually, the ladies' loos outside the tavern, quite a good place for looking for moths. So these beautiful tiger moths can cause a great deal of excitement. Top left, the cream spot tiger, one which is becoming scarce on the mainland. But Lundy does seem to have a good population of those. Garden tiger, bottom left, is flashing the bright coloured underwing. That's a bit intimidating to a small bird. Might startle it just enough for the moth to be able to escape. And summer's afternoon on the island, particularly around the south end, and you can't really miss the burnet moths, vast numbers of them sometimes. When the Field Society was founded nearly 75 years ago, this is really what people did with moths, to study moths. You would catch them, generally kill a good selection of them. They'd have pins stuck in them, be mounted in boxes, and maybe lots and lots of the same species to look for variation, and then put away in drawers or cabinets somewhere. There must be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of moths like this now never seeing the light of day. Well, we don't do that anymore. Well, very rarely. Sometimes you need to dissect a moth to know what it is, because digital photography means that we can get excellent photographs. We can share information, we can learn a lot more about the moths without having to stick pins in them. So wandering around on the island, how are you going to find a moth to study? You might accidentally brush something out of vegetation. You might have really sharp eyes and spot something perhaps sitting on a stone wall. Many of them are perfectly camouflaged, so they blend in really well. And not only do they blend in really well, but during the day, they're not going to fly around like butterflies in the sunshine. Occasionally, a moth will land on something that doesn't quite camouflage it, but most of the time, they're really difficult to spot. You sometimes see stone chats or wheatears, meadow pipits maybe, searching along a wall or in vegetation, and they would be better at finding the moths than we are. Well, butterflies generally, like the sunshine, They will often bask on rocks or on vegetation, make themselves a bit more obvious. The Lundy red admirals are worth a look. Now, you can see my cursor. This red bar, which all red admirals have, sometimes has a little white spot in it. Not all red admirals have that. The Lundy ones seem to have that tiny little speck. You need to get a close look to see it. And usually you'll find that one population, they'll all be like that with a white speck. Others won't have it. And I thought I'd better put in that rather large and intimidating fly as well, because when you're out in sunny butterfly weather, often there are lots of other insects come along as well. Now, it's a bit confusing sometimes because you can't make a general rule about butterflies always sit with their wings out flat or moths fold their wings up. And there are differences, of course. Moths generally have feathery antennae. Butterfly have club-like antennae, but some moths will sit and look a bit like a butterfly. This scalloped oak is one with quite a large moth, which you'd find in places like this in amongst the foxgloves. And on the way down to the North Light, or on particularly sunny spots east side, you might find a butterfly that doesn't really want to be seen. It folds itself up and does its best to look a bit like a camouflage moth. The grayling will sit and align itself up with the sun so it doesn't cast a shadow at all. Keep absolutely still. If you brush past it, it might fly, but very quickly settle down again. So you really can't see it. It's quite a scarce butterfly now, and Lundy is a very good place to see that. Of course, not all moths look like moths or butterflies, and the thrift clearwing moth, very special moth, the Lundy, our scientific name, Musciformis, which means in the form of a fly. But it is a moth, looking a bit like a hoverfly. And Lundy is probably one of the best places to see this. You can imagine sitting down on the west side somewhere up at the north end on a lovely sunny June afternoon, and the chances are you might see these little fly-like insects flying around. There are other ways of attracting them because the males are attracted to pheromones that the females emit. And if you use that pheromone, sometimes you'll find a whole swarm of these fly-like moths flying around you. But they don't really conform to what we might think. So moths look like butterflies. Some butterflies act like moths. The early thorn, very colourful and attractive moth, gets the name thorn because of the shape of the caterpillar. The burnet moths can't really miss. If you're there during the summer, there will be sometimes swarms of burnet moths clustering on thistle heads. They feed down, or the larvae feed down in the vegetation. They'll be feeding on things like bird's foot trefoil. And when the caterpillar is ready to pupate, it will climb up a grass stem and then form this transparent or slightly transparent cocoon. And you will see hundreds of these sometimes. And then eventually there'll be a mass emergence. And this is a female which has emerged, and she has attracted a male. The mating takes place quite quickly, and then females will go off and lay their eggs. You get a mass emergence. It's quite spectacular sometimes when you see the thistle heads covered with lots and lots of those. Well, a nice sunny bank down at the southwest point of the island, bird's foot trefoil, thrift, nectar-producing plants, good food plants, and that's where we'd expect to find some of the typical grassland butterflies. Not much good when there's a howling gale coming in from the west or mist sweeping in, but of course we do get lovely sunny days, and so butterflies like the common blue really like this. The bird's foot trefoil is the food plant for the larvae of the common blue. That small copper, again, likes to bask in the sunshine. This one will lay its eggs on sheep's sorrel, which there's plenty of at the south end. And the small heath, another one which likes the sunny afternoons, that probably will choose rough grassland to lay its eggs. What we don't have much of on Lundy, of course, is woodland. We do have some tree cover. Milcombe is a wooded area. And so the woodland butterflies that you might expect on the mainland are quite scarce or absent. However, there are plenty of shady places. The bracken provides a bit of shade and cover, as well as the trees that we do have. And so it's areas like this where you might expect to see the butterflies that on the mainland you get in woodland clearings or grassy rides along the edge of meadows. Now, there was a thought some years ago that the Lundy meadow browns but very slightly different from those on the mainland. And I'm not sure that anybody has had a really good look. The Isles of Scilly have a population of meadow grounds which vary very slightly from those on the mainland. So there's a nice study there for somebody. We have a few moths on Lundy, which are very scarce elsewhere. Lundy is a good place to see this one, a tiny little, very insignificant looking micro moth. And it's only on Lundy because we have its food plant, which is quite scarce. So just a few dots on the map, 2, 3 places maybe in Britain where this moth occurs, one of which is Lundy. And the food plant is balm-leaf figwort that we've all seen as we walk up the beach road. And this map of the distribution of balm-leaf figwort shows that that is actually quite scarce as well. So for many moths, they're very much linked to their food plant. And sadly, we've lost one moth from Lundy, which I know of in my lifetime, the horehound plume moth, because we've lost the white horehound. So we do need to be careful. The moths are tied in to the plants that feed them. But on that beach road area, the Devonshire wainscot, quite a scarce moth, very coastal moth, that seems to like that habitat, this sort of undercliff habitat, and fairly sheltered. It wouldn't be very happy on the west side, but here on the east side, we find the ideal habitat for it. So not the Lundy wainscot, I'm afraid, but Devonshire wainscot. But how do we get all these moths to study them? You see, it's very difficult to find them when you're walking around the island. You're not really going to see them unless you accidentally disturb one. So moth trapping comes into play. And there are many designs and styles of moth traps. But basically, it's a very bright bulb which attracts the moths. And then around the bulb or below it, you have things like egg boxes that the moths can go and hide in. It doesn't kill the moths. That's not the idea for doing it. They'll fly to it. Some will stay there until the morning. Some might fly away. But it's a very effective way of catching the moths that otherwise you couldn't find. Outside Old Light Cottage here is a good sheltered spot. Against the wall is good because sometimes the moths don't go in the trap. They'll just sit on the wall and you can have a look at them at night or get them in the morning. And all sorts of things which are very, very difficult to find during the day. The lesser yellow underwing, this one, quite a widespread moth in Britain, but this form with the very distinct markings is only found on Lundy and the Isles of Scilly. The moth books always describe this particular form, Lundy. So you will get the ordinary lesser yellow underwing moth on Lundy, but it's quite good to spot that one, very local to the island. But Devon moth trappers, they might remember the late Tony Dobson, who very kindly donated a moth trap to the island, which I used when I'm there. But this is the scene usually in the morning. You get there, you don't have to stay out all night watching the trap. In the morning when the bulb has gone off, you can open it up and the moths will generally just sit there. Some of them will fly straight off as soon as you get near the trap, and most of them will sit there in the daytime because that's what they do. They're not on the right camouflage material, but they will sit and let you have a closer look at them. And Milcombe's a very good site for moth trapping, and this is yet another design of trap. This is my portable trap, which has been over and back to Lundy. I don't know how many times. It's covered in luggage labels and stickers, transports very well. The battery and all the bits and pieces all fold down inside. And the advantage of this one is it doesn't rely on the generator being on at night. You can put it anywhere, used it in all sorts of places, particularly up at the Old Light and sheltered by walls. And it gets terrific catches. So when you open up the trap in the morning, never quite know what you're going to see. Selection here of ermine moths and a brocade. Most of them will allow you to have a close look. Usually you will do is take some little plastic pots, catch the moths very carefully, sometimes photograph them right away because they will not allow too many liberties. If you try and move the moth, often it will fly straight off. Sometimes you have almost uncountable numbers of a particular species. The bright-lined brown eye is a very, very common moth on Lundy, and sometimes there are hundreds of those clustered around the trap. So an important thing to do when you get there in the morning is open the trap up properly, very carefully count and look all around the trap as well to see if there are any moths sitting on the grass, and record the numbers. That's important because we are noticing now a decline in some species. Maybe photograph them and then release them afterwards. One of my favourite locations, of course, is Milcombe, because there's plenty of room. I can commandeer the kitchen table first thing in the morning before anybody gets up, comes down for breakfast, spread out moth pots, books, notes, cameras all over the place, and then start sorting out the moths. An added advantage is that the cork table mats are the ideal thing to put the moths on. I'll put everybody off now using them, I think, but the moths sit very nicely on these table mats and you can get good photographs of them. And then by the time you've done that, it may be the moths starting to warm up a little bit and you can take them outside and release them. So shoulder stripe wainscot, a nice name, a mullein wave. Some of the names relate to what the caterpillars feed on, so mullein, but wainscot, a sort of Dickensian word, wainscoting is the name for the wood panelling, which people would line studies and dining rooms with, and shoulder stripe because of this distinctive marking. Interesting thing about all the macro moths is that they all have English names, really good descriptive English names. Carpet moths cause a bit of alarm sometimes. They don't eat your carpets. There are lots of carpet moths. They're not at all interested in carpets. But the name really relates to the very attractive patterns that they have. And a moth trapping event is quite a good way to introduce people to this interesting world that most people are not really aware of. And here we are after a session some years ago, I think in September time, when sorting out the catch in the tavern out at night. I'm explaining here to people how the moth trap works. We have to be a bit careful not to stare at the bulb. The UV light is harmful to our eyes if we look at it for too long, but moths have very different eyes from ours. They have multifaceted eyes and they see many small images. They, of course, use light for navigation, and the moth trap bulb, what confuses them, they fly to that rather than the moon, for example, which they'll be navigating by, and end up in the trap. And they're diligently recording the moths, writing them down, identifying, and only when they've all been identified, recorded, we've got the numbers, then final important stage is to let them all go again. And you can't just chuck them out the window because there will be house sparrows and starlings, robins, all sorts of things waiting for them, or they'll settle on the path and get stepped on. So important thing to do, take the moths outside and generally try and find something that matches the markings or the camouflage. So this one, the barred red, isn't really in a very suitable place. Sitting on a rock face like that, it's completely obvious. So a bird would soon find that. So what we're doing here with the moths is matching up the moth to tree bark or lichens or some rock somewhere, and then coaxing it out of the pot. And they generally then will stay there unless something finds it. The September event, this was a national moth night some years ago when the focus was on migration. So birds migrate, of course, but so do moths. And we're looking for things which arrived on Lundy, perhaps carried by southerly winds, moths which are not resident on the island. We did actually get lots of resident species then, and a common one in the autumn, large yellow underwing. We'll see a bit later on how it got its name. And the rustic moths have a plain garb. A Victorian naturalist who named them, gave them all these interesting names. And the rosy rustic, rather more attractive one. We've lost the label for this one. The scarce bordered straw, a migrant moth, quite a rare one. So we've finished all the work, we've identified, recorded and released them, so it's coffee time. And the beer garden is a good place for moth trapping because the flowering privet tree there attracts moths in for the nectar. And then, of course, when the light attracts them, they go into the trap. I mentioned Milcombe being a favourite location. It's ideal because it's in a sheltered spot. The white walls really increase the effect of the moth trap bulb. The light shines out a great distance. So we get some very good catches there. And it's very exciting if you catch a new moth that's new for the island. And the netted pug in this case, very small moth, is good. It's also very good when it's completely obvious. There's no discussion about what it might be. The food plant for the netted pug is sea campion. As you know, sea campion doesn't really grow that close to Milcombe. Plenty of it on the island, so perhaps if we did more trapping or had been doing trapping out on the cliffs on the west side somewhere, we might have caught this before. So it ought to have been there. Surprised we haven't caught it before, but nice to get a new one. And I mentioned the records, so very important. If you do find something, photographs, please. We've all got phones in our pockets now, so we can photograph them, and then records in the logbook, so we can build up this Lundy moth list. If you don't need a moth trap, you could go out with a torch at night, or you could just have sharp eyes maybe and spot them, because they're all out there somewhere. All those hundreds of species that we have will be present. They'll be maybe hiding, or they'll be sitting quietly, resting on something. Sometimes they don't always choose the right place. They become quite obvious. Some, of course, are active during the day. Sunny afternoon in Milcombe, just check the fuchsia, because hummingbird hawk moths just cannot resist. This is a migrant moth, the smallest of our hawk moths, just about. Possibly might some years have bred on Lundy. The food plant for the caterpillars for this one is honeysuckle. And so there's a chance that we may have had a second generation sometimes. As the seasons progress, so too does the moth population that arrive on the island. So come to harvest time, we get a whole different set of moths. Frosted orange, for example, is a good sign of autumn coming along. And occasionally, maybe accidentally, things like grasshoppers will end up in the moth trap. They're not really attracted to the light, and maybe we disturb them when we're getting near to the trap. There are biblical references to moths, of course, and was the old idea that it was the moths that ate your clothes isn't really correct, because it's not the moths, it's the larvae of the moths that do that. When we started on the church restoration, Michael mentioned, it must be about 12 years ago, lots of things went into a skip, but I did rescue this, a moth-eaten kneeler from the church, which is now in a place of safety. But of course, it's not the adult moths that do the eating. Moths don't have mouth parts which enable them to do that sort of thing. But there are one or two species only which would lay their eggs on material like this. And those moths would originally have been ones that laid their eggs perhaps in birds' nests, or found discarded feathers or other material, animal fur perhaps. The larvae would feed on that. So don't worry if you have any sort of moth, a large moth flying around in your house, it's not going to eat your carpets. So walking around on the island, you really do need to keep your eyes open. Some of them are incredibly difficult to spot. The Chinese character, for example, looks a bit like a bird dropping. You'll sit on a leaf and you wouldn't give it a second glance unless perhaps you had a magnifying glass, have a proper look at it. And the pugs, we saw the netted pug earlier on, very small, very delicate moths. Often by the time they get to the trap, they're a little bit worn. They've lost the scales on their wings and the patterns start to disappear. The foxglove pug, as the name suggests, lays its eggs on foxgloves. We have a number of them, mostly related to certain food plants. But this doesn't really look like moth habitat. It's not really, but as well as getting moths in the trap, we get quite a lot of other insects. Caddisflies, for example, actually quite closely related to moths and have very similar life cycles. They lay eggs. From the eggs, we get a larva, which might live underwater, mostly live underwater, perhaps in a case, and then it will pupate and then emerge as an adult. And the adult is the dispersal stage, and they seem to be attracted to lights in moth traps. And we get a lot of very good records of caddisflies that we otherwise wouldn't realize were there. Now, the micro moths are a bit tricky. For a start, they're very small. There are many more of them than there are macro moths, and lots of them look very, very similar. There are minute differences between them. Some of them seem to involve dissection in order to determine what they are, but just a few are quite striking, like this one. A very nice name. That sounds like an indignant cat, doesn't it? The rose-flounced tabby. But this one always props itself up, sits with its front legs holding up the head. So that's a very distinctive one. And the foxglove, or the honeysuckle moth, is another very distinctive one. The markings and that turned up tail make it quite easy to identify. The one thing you would notice, look closely at the leaves of almost any tree or shrub, are these little squiggly lines in the leaves. And these are the feeding signs of the larvae, generally of micro moths. The very, very tiny caterpillars can live within the thickness of a leaf and then eventually emerge as the adult moth. It would have started there somewhere with an egg laid on the leaf, little caterpillar would then have burrowed in, and as it moved through and grew, so the tunnel that it lived in grew larger and larger, and finally here, somewhere, it would have pupated, then emerged as an adult moth, whatever species. Some moths are very good at exploiting new habitats. A number of them, like the angle shades, have a wide range of food plants, and clearing the rhododendrons meant that a whole new area of vegetation was able to appear on the east side. And so some can quickly take advantage of that. Another distinctive moth. Others, like this one, the hoary footman, quite like mosses and lichens, particularly lichens on bare rocks. When the rhododendrons were there, of course, nothing grew beneath the rhododendrons, and exposing all that rock and bare soil meant that the food plants for this footman and many other species increased. Nobody seems to like bracken, but and they think, well, it's crowding everything else out, nothing eats it, nothing lives in it. But in fact, there are quite a few things that like bracken, like the brown silverline, quite a common summer moth, very distinctive, very attractive species, and the larvae of that definitely feed on bracken. Now, you sometimes get the feeling you're not alone when you're checking your moth trap, and very soon a number of birds learn what's going on. And so you have crows watching, house sparrows, starlings, robins, all know. So it's a good idea not to run your moth trap night after night after night in the same place, because things will soon learn that there's a ready meal there. And the pygmy shrews, of course, being insectivorous small mammals, very quickly know about the moths. And a number of occasions have opened up the moth trap, heard a scrabbling sound inside, looked in, and there's been a very plump shrew, or more than one sometimes, a litter of wings and legs and shrew droppings. The beetles also will find their way in. Sexton beetles, these are the burying beetles, the ones which, if they were to find a dead shrew, would bury it, lay their eggs in it, and the larvae would feed on it. And the sexton beetles, and the shrews for that matter, are incredibly smelly. Sometimes you smell it before you get to it. One of my tricks with school parties, of course, is to put a sexton beetle in a pot, and after a minute or so, get someone to have a sniff. You would not believe, it must be the smelliest beetle known to science. Well, now, out on top of the island, if you don't find the moths, sometimes you will find these larvae, and we get quite a lot of comments in the logbook about these, either the emperor moth larvae, the big green one, really large, size of your little finger, or fox moth larvae, particularly. We're quite likely to see these out roaming about on top of the island. But sometimes you find one which is a bit moribund. It can barely move. And if you look closely, you need a hand lens maybe, you will see emerging from it smaller larvae, little maggot-like creatures. And these are the larvae of a parasitic wasp, which will have laid its eggs inside the growing caterpillar. The larvae then feed inside the caterpillar, and then when they're ready to pupate, they emerge from it, leaving a hollowed out, empty, dead caterpillar behind. That's one of the many ways in which the caterpillars are unable to make it to become adult moths or butterflies. Now that, had it not been parasitized, would have been either a female, or in this case, or a male fox moth, one of our largest, most distinctive moths. And the green caterpillar we saw earlier on, out on top of the island, would be the emperor moth, the male, bottom left, female, a bit larger. And continuing the food chain idea, the cuckoo is about the only bird which can really cope with those large, bristly, hairy caterpillars, and it will parasitize the nests of birds like meadowpipits. The meadowpipits themselves will feed on the larvae of the smaller moths. Now, I mentioned at the start, the moths obviously don't want to be eaten. Some of them will be brightly colored, others will hide away. Same sort of things apply to the caterpillars. And the lackey moths, very obvious, you can't really miss those, but they can retreat into this little silky nest that they weave, and also they twitch very alarmingly and sometimes drop to the ground. So that's very off-putting for a predatory bird. The broom moth lines itself up along the thin stems of the broom. It would be almost impossible to see. Now, the bright-lined brown eye I mentioned is one of the commonest moths, and sometimes get these catches of hundreds, but during the day, they're out there somewhere and usually deep down in vegetation. You might just disturb them. This is greater bird's foot trefoil, and the chances are they'll be down somewhere in the depths of that, or other moths during the day will hide on stems like this, keep absolutely still. This is the seaside thistle or slender thistle, and dead stems, hollow stems, very important places for them. Some a bit conspicuous, but they love the stone walls and they can easily find their way into the crevices between the rocks on the wall, tops of walls. Now, some of the tiniest moths are migrant species, and depending on the weather and the season, we often get falls of these, as you might expect, large numbers of warblers suddenly to arrive on the island. So the rusty dot pearl, which is a really small moth, size of your little fingernail, can arrive in a great wave. But the moths fly really well, and the silver Y, named because of this silver Y marking on the wings, is a very good flyer. It's one which will fly during the day. You sometimes see it nectaring. People sometimes think there's a hummingbird hawk moth feeding on some flowers. Quite likely to be one of these, and a great wave of these can arrive. The tissue, now Tim, I'm not sure if you're watching, but found this one at Stonycroft 3 or 4 years ago and sent me the picture. And the food plant for this moth doesn't occur on Lundy. It's buckthorn. We definitely don't have that. But there would be buckthorn in North Devon or South Wales maybe. And so this one obviously has made a long journey across the sea to get to the island. And we don't get very many records of this one. So flight is extremely important. I get asked sometimes how long moths live, and most of them have a sort of annual life cycle, and they'll overwinter perhaps as an egg or in a pupa or perhaps even an adult. And so the herald will be one of those which does that. They'll find places, tree bark maybe, in vegetation somewhere, or caves or cellars or outhouses to hibernate. Not quite the easiest thing to do, of course, because lurking in caves on Lundy, of course, you know, we have this population of the cave spider, one of Britain's largest spiders, and that would make a tasty meal for the cave spider. Now, I mentioned earlier on the lesser yellow or the large yellow underwing, one which we catch regularly in the autumn, not always obvious how it got its name until you see it flying. You hear this very striking pattern. It's thought that this is partly to alarm, warn off a predator, a potential predator, so partly a warning and maybe for recognition as well. I just had a message on my screen. The brimstone moth, looking very much like a little delicate butterfly here. During the day, it will sit quietly and not be all that obvious, looking maybe like a fallen leaf, but at night is a very beautiful creature. Now, I mentioned new colonies of things starting up sometimes. We've lost one moth at least because we've lost the food plant, but we gained wood vetch some years ago. Probably haven't gained this yet. The scarce blackneck feeds only on wood vetch. Now, wood vetch occurs on the mainland in North Devon, North Cornwall, and the moth occurs in 1 or 2 places. So there's just a chance that the scarce blackneck can find its way across the sea and maybe start up a colony, so a new moth record for Lundy, because the food plant is there. So really we need to keep recording, keep looking, keep the records up, and make sure that the Lundy moth list continues to grow. Now, if you want to find out what the Lundy moth list actually looks like, have a look at the Lundy Field Society website, and you'll be able to work through the system there and get to a list which is updated regularly. And you'll see there, we've got things like the first record of this species or whether or not it's rare or common. There are other lists available which you can find. One that was produced 6 years ago. I think since then the list will have grown. And the Devon Moth Group, of course, keep records. So there are lots of sources of information. And every year our annual report will publish the findings, what new species have occurred, any particularly good nights or numbers. There's plenty of information there, but it's really important that everybody who goes there and spots a moth or something interesting keeps the records for us in the logbook. For further reading, I have to get in a plug here, of course, this Collins Complete Guide, Butterflies and Moths, of which I'm one of the the three authors, a lot of it was photographed on Lundy. Many of the species in this book occur on the island. They were photographed there, maybe in Milcombe Kitchen or on those cork table mats. And in this book, we have illustrations of all the moths shown life size. You've got a good idea, and then blown up so you can identify them. And then some field shots as well. So hopefully you'd find that helpful. Well, next year we have Discover Lundy coming up, week of activities. I'm sure there'll be some moth trapping then. And every year there is a national moth night. When it's been possible, we've done some event for it on Lundy. I think for next year, the date hasn't been fixed yet. But if you were to Google National Moth Night 2021, when the date is fixed, you'll be able to find out when it was. And the chances are there would be an activity on Lundy related to National Moth Night. So there are lots of mothy things going on the island. So don't worry if you haven't got a trap, you're not sure what they are. There's plenty of help out there, and all records are really welcome. Now, I should thank my colleagues for providing some of the pictures and the information. And I think my time is up, so it's time to head back down to the boat. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant, Andrew. Thank you very much for that really, really interesting talk. The illustrations were fantastic. So many photographs. I suppose I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to go out moth trapping with you on Lundy quite a few years ago, and went through the catch the following morning. It was fascinating to really understand the massive variety of moths that we found during just one session. I'm going to just remind everybody at home that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function below. So do click on the Q&A button on the Zoom session. I can see we've already got our first question in, which is from Belinda Cox. Hello, B. B says, thank you, Andrew. Are there any particular moths I should keep an eye open for when I'm on the island at the end of this week?
The end of this week? Well, some of those migrant moths, things like the scarce bordered straw, would be a good one. It's the right time of year when things are moving, and maybe that special Lundy lesser yellow underwing would be one to find. And I think there have been reports of hummingbird hawk moths as well. If the weather stays mild, then there's every chance to see those. Look around where the fuchsias are flowering.
Thank you. We've got a few comments coming in the chat. Helen Cole says, fantastic photos of moths in flight. Kathy Mead says, thank you very much. I have a moth trap and the book. Great memories of Lundy when she visited a few years ago. The next question I have is from David Can, and he asks, do any species eat Lundy cabbage? Good question.
Yes, well, there are some moths that are described as polyphagous that'll eat anything, but mainly it would be the butterflies. I didn't mention, we'd be here all night if we had all the butterflies and all the moths, but the white butterflies, of course, will feed on Lundy cabbage. So yes, there might well be some moths. I'm not sure about that. Something to look into, but it would be butterflies mainly rather than the moths.
Claire Mitchell has got a question. Good to see that you're here, Claire. She asks, you mentioned about migration. How far can moths or I suppose butterflies travel by migration?
Well, we regularly get things like painted ladies, which would have started their journey in Africa and gone in various hops across the Mediterranean, across Europe, and found their way to Lundy. Clouded yellows that do the same sort of thing. So traveling across the Mediterranean and across Europe is no problem. And the monarch butterflies will come from places, maybe Canaries, and possibly even from America. So some of them will, obviously assisted by the right sort of winds, weather conditions, could travel across a whole ocean to get to Lundy. But many of them will go quite considerable journeys. Some are actually sedentary and just don't move. But it seems that, well, the more we know about them, we'll realize what impressive migrations they can make.
I think I can ask you a question, which I'd quite like to know the answer to, which is what is the most interesting moth or butterfly that we might find on Lundy, in your opinion?
Well, I think it would be something like one of the a monarch butterfly if it had really come from America. It'd be something which would be a very long distance migrant. But what would be good would be to get perhaps back some of the ones that we've lost through losing the food plants or some of the scarcities. And there are different forms of moths. It would be interesting to know that maybe studying things like the meadow browns to decide that they really are different from the ones on the mainland. You can see a nice student project forming there.
Yes, yes, and if we can find somebody that wants to study it, then
Yes,
they could apply for a grant from the Lundy Field Society.
I was going to say, yes, grants are available, yes, yes.
So what do you think is the rarest thing that you found on the island?
Well, I think the netted pug moth, the very distinctive one, which is a first record for Lundy, but it must have been there for a long, long time before because the food plant is there, just that we haven't really looked in the right place. And one of the problems is that the generator generally goes off at night. So running a moth trap means that you're near where there's a source of power and run it until midnight. But now portable moth traps are much better. It really is getting at running traps on more inaccessible places. And I've run traps around the castle and over the walls at the old light, in place when there hasn't been a howling gale. I had terrific catches there. And I think people have trapped up at Tibbets. So what we need to do really is to extend into other habitats or sheltered places like Gannett's Combe. So that involves carting a whole load of gear up there, batteries and so on, not necessarily sitting out with the trap all night. So there's still a lot more we could find out about what's there. I'm sure there are many more discoveries to be made. The Lundy moth list is smaller than the Devon moth list because we don't have quite the range of habitats there, but we haven't looked in all the places yet. So I'm sure there's more to find.
That leads quite nicely onto a question from Carol Lee. Carol asks, will there be any moth-related activities during the Discover Lundy Week next year? And I suppose that will give us an opportunity to discover some new moth species.
Well, I would hope so, with lots of pairs of eyes there, running plenty of traps. It was a good way to find new things. And moth trapping is one way of doing it, but I mentioned disturbing vegetation. And if people have sweep nets, it's like a butterfly net with a strong frame, and very carefully swish it through long grass near honeysuckle or foxgloves, surprising how many moths you can find like that. And also going out doing what we call dusking, so just as night falls, going somewhere where there are flowers, particularly honeysuckle, things that release their scent at night, shining a bright torch around or swishing a net around, then you can find new things. So Discover Lundy is a good opportunity of lots of willing helpers go out and cover an area really thoroughly.
Yes, and certainly as the organiser of Discover Lundy next year, we're certainly hoping that we can do those sorts of activities. Of course, at the moment, we're not entirely sure what will be possible, but it's certainly on the list of activities that we hope to be able to run. And we've run moth trapping events very successfully in the past during previous Discover Lundy weeks.
I've showed a picture of the late Anthony Dobson, no longer with us now, but a Devon mothman. And what he used to do was, going to a particular site, was immediately ask for a list of all the plants for that site. And then he'd look through the plants and say, well, this is the food plant for this moth or that one or whatever, and predict what should be there based on the food plants. So we now have a list of the Lundy plants. So that's the next thing to do, really, to think, well, what's missing? Honeysuckle is there, where we've got the honeysuckle moth and the foxglove pug, so on. We've lost the horehound plume, but that would be a very interesting thing to predict. Something ought to be here somewhere, work out where it should be. Another nice student project coming up.
Absolutely, yes, yes. Brian and Lisa Woodcock say hello to you, Andrew. Fantastic talk and very interesting. We didn't realise how many different moths there are around. When we're next on Lundy, we'll have a more in-depth look for them.
Good, thank you.
John Hedger, hello John. John asks, do caterpillars on bracken accumulate the rather nasty chemicals from the bracken? And and does the same also apply to the rhododendron?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. Should find out, but I would guess so. They're probably not very palatable to marauding birds. So the brown silver-line moth is a particularly common one. It obviously does quite well, but I don't know whether the moth itself is toxic. The cinnabar moth larvae that feed on ragwort accumulate the toxin that's in ragwort. So it is highly likely, but so that another student project coming up then, find out if silver-line larvae are toxic. I would imagine they would, yes.
Thank you. Question from Peter Long. Peter asks, is there any indication in the Lundy Lepidoptera records to indicate species distributions are being affected by climate change?
Yes, it would be new species, Mediterranean or southern species arriving. We need, unfortunately, the early lists are not very complete. There wasn't much moth trapping years ago, and it's only in recent years that we've had regular moth trapping and proper lists kept. And we've had records, rather sketchy records from the past. So it'd be a little bit difficult to be absolutely certain about that. So we do get new moth species, but it may be because we just didn't find them before. I think the evidence is that we're getting more sort of southern species.
Thank you. Joanne Wilby, hello Joe. She says, another great talk, Andrew.
Thank you, Joanne.
I've learned recently that moths can be pollinators in the same way that bees are. Are there any of the Lundy visitors pollinators?
Quite a number of them that would do that. The things that feed on honeysuckle, for example, and the hummingbird hawk moth feeding on the fuchsia would do that. And some adult moths don't feed at all, but the ones that do generally have a long tongue, and they would visit flowers for nectar for a little bit of energy. So yes, they are, quite a number of them that are attracted to the sort of night scented plants are very important as pollinators.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder at home, if you want to ask a question, then do use the Q&A function. I've got a question from Belinda Parry, who asks, is moth migration deliberate or accidental?
That's a very good question. Yes, the things like, well, actually a butterfly rather than moth, painted lady, is definitely deliberate because they spread out in order to find new habitats for breeding. Some moths will be blown off course, caught up in southerly winds, for example. But it's more of a sort of an eruption, a dispersal. They're spreading out and not necessarily heading in a particular direction for some reason, but they disperse from a habitat where they first appeared in order to find new habitat. And then, because maybe rather weak flyers, are at the mercy of prevailing winds. So there are some years when we don't get so many, but it's more of a dispersal maybe than a deliberate migration.
A question from Kathy Mead, who asks if October is a good month for moth trapping. I'm wondering whether Kathy's coming to Lundy this month.
Yes, the things that are not much good for moth trapping would be a clear moonlit night with very low temperatures. So any sort of muggy night with no moon, slightly humid, not a howling gale, would be very good. And yes, there are moths that appear in every month of the year. So there is a November moth, a December moth, a January moth. I'm not sure about February, but there are moths. You can get moths all through the year. You may not get quite the range, but unless the weather is really awful, chances are that you will always get something. You find a sheltered spot. You may get a limited range, but sometimes big numbers. So even in the depths of winter, the winter moth will be out. So yes, it's well worth doing this. Well worth running a trap if you've got one, or even going out with your torch at night.
Yes, I don't know whether there's been any moth trapping on Lundy recently, whether Dean, the warden's been doing any trapping, or whether the Tims have done anything. The conditions of the last couple of days, we've had a couple of clear nights, but now there's a sort of reasonably strong easterly building up, so probably not very conducive to moth trapping.
Well, a mild, gentle easterly continental wind would be quite good because it would bring things from the east. But you don't really want a very low temperature. If it drops below about 6 degrees centigrade, and chances are they're not going to be all that active.
Kathy's followed up to say that she's not actually coming to Lundy this month, sadly.
Okay, well, can moth trap at home then.
Yeah, sorry to hear that, Kathy. Okay, well, I will take the last couple of questions here now. So Jan Paul asks, very interesting talk, thank you. You indicated that some moths have to be killed to fully identify them. What if you suspect that they are rare or low in numbers?
Well, I personally don't do that. And the ones that are killed in order to identify them are often quite common species, two very, very similar species with minute differences between them. And so if you really need to know, that's what you'd have to do. But it is not very common practice these days. And certainly if it's a rarity or first record replaced, then no, you wouldn't do it. You don't need to do that. It's in very few instances do you actually need to do that. And I'd advise against it if you don't know what you're doing.
Good to hear that. David Can has a follow-up question from his one earlier on. You mentioned the list of Lundy plants.
Yeah.
When is the flora being published?
Oh dear. Yeah, live it down. Well, if Clive's State hasn't changed all the names and the order of everything, I wouldn't have to rejig the list. But we're nearly finished with rejigging the list of the names. The original list of the Lundy flora then had to be redone when the Botanist's Bible, Stace Volume 4 came out. Everything was in a different order, slightly different names. And we keep adding new species, of course. Doesn't help.
Yes, yes, of course. Okay, well, that ends the Q&A session. I've got a few bits and pieces to tell everyone about. Firstly, I need to get my slide up on the screen. Where are we? He says he's not very prepared. Right, here we go. So I need to get my usual plug-in for the Lundy Field Society. So if you've not yet joined the Lundy Field Society, then please do join us. Membership is open to all. You can find out more by visiting the LFS website, which is up on the screen, or finding us on social media. So please do join if you're not already a member. So I mentioned the forthcoming programme of talks. I've got a provisional programme put together. I'm planning to hold an event at least once a month. And I'm also hoping that we can get together for something a bit different before Christmas. This is the programme as it stands, which is up on the screen at the moment. The next talk will be when John Hedger and Mandy D join me to tell me, or tell us, about Lundy's mushrooms, toadstools and fungi. John and Mandy will be live on Lundy that time. I'm not expecting to be on Lundy when they do their talk, but John and Mandy will be here. And their talk is going to be based on what they found during the preceding days of their visit to Lundy. So I'm sure that'll be a really, really interesting talk. So really looking forward to that one. I'll just leave that slide up on the screen for a moment so that you can see what else is coming up. Details on how to join each talk will be posted on social media, and of course members of the Lundy Field Society will get an email from me detailing how you can sign up or watch on YouTube. Moving on, previously you will have received excuse me, an email asking you to complete a feedback survey after the webinar. We believe that Zoom has changed how all this works, and so now the request to complete the survey will pop up in a web browser when you leave the Zoom session. So you won't get an email, you'll get a window will pop up. But whatever happens, I'd be grateful for your feedback, please. Thank you very much. That's pretty much it, really. My thanks to both Dave Richards for hosting us this evening and to Andrew for a really wonderful talk. So thank you very much, Dave, and thank you, Andrew. Really, I suppose it's just time to say goodbye. So, Andrew, would you like to say cheerio to our audience?
Thank you, Michael, for organising this, and Dave for hosting it. And thanks everyone for tuning in and watching. Please send in your moth records.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody, for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm off to the tavern now for a beer, but I hope to see